quite a windfall, but I can't help but ask, really, for how long, given the pressure on prices right now?
Well, good question. We could well be at the peak, but high oil prices have been very good for Saudi Arabia's state-controlled oil company. Its second quarter profit blows away all prior records. As mentioned, $48.4 billion dwarfs the profit of any listed company in the world.
Which company earns the most money globally? Apple is perhaps the most frequent response. Given that Apple is the biggest firm in the world and one of the most well-known brands, this makes sense, though is not by any means the most profitable business. This honor goes to the fictitious business Saudi Aramco. If you're not familiar with Saudi Aramco, you should know that it's the country of Saudi Arabia's national oil corporation and has continuously rated at the top of the Fortune 500. Although historically they have frequently been the most profitable company in the world, their profits over the last year are unheard of. You are undoubtedly aware of how expensive gas is in general. Even though things have somewhat calmed down since their height a few months ago, prices are still fairly high in comparison to earlier times. This is bad news for average people who are just trying to get by, but it turns out to be a blessing in disguise for the oil business. Saudi Arabia was making approximately $1 billion per day at its peak merely from oil exports. Furthermore, Saudi Aramco's most recent fiscal year earnings total $279 billion. In comparison, this is more than twice the revenue of Apple, $120 billion. Furthermore, it is comparable to the combined revenues of Apple, Google, and Microsoft. Another thing to remember is that oil prices have only been rising for a year. As 2022 approaches, Saudi Aramco's rolling 12-month profits should soar even higher, possibly exceeding $300 billion. Saudi Aramco could acquire Samsung with that much cash and still have $30 billion in cash left over. Saudi Arabia hasn't always had it easy, though. In actuality, a large portion of Saudi Arabia was merely a conglomeration of tribes vying for survival a century ago. You may say they just got lucky with the oil, but even if they did, their natural resources were insufficient to create such an empire. Consider Venezuela, which not only has more oil than Saudi Arabia but also discovered it decades earlier, if you don't believe me. Such a country should be opulently wealthy, but instead it is extremely impoverished and plagued by hyperinflation. The same could be said of Canada, which has the world's third largest oil reserves. Of course, Canada is not doing badly, but given that it has been a developed country for far longer than Saudi Arabia, one would expect it to be able to make much better use of its oil resources. But, given that, how did Saudi Arabia win the oil race? Looking back, Saudi Arabia did not enter the oil business late. In actuality, they entered the oil industry very tardily, and their entry was not particularly well planned. It was only a last-ditch wager. In the decades before it began its search for oil, Saudi Arabia didn't even exist. Instead, the House of Saud and the House of Rashid, two rival houses, governed the area. There was no obvious victor, with the House of Saud winning occasionally and the family of Rashid winning occasionally. It was essentially a massive power struggle that yielded no results. However, when the century turned into the 1900s, everything changed. The ruling Rashidi family was in power at the time, and Saudi King Abdulaziz Al Saud was living in exile in Kuwait. However, Abdul had not forgotten about the Rashid family, and he was merely planning his 1902 counterattack. Abdul took Riyadh back with his first attack, but that was just the start of a string of victories that would restore the Sauds to power. Like the Sauds before them, the Rashids were driven into exile, but the narrative was far from over. The Rashidi family, like the Sauds, may retaliate at any time, and the Saudi family was well aware of this. They set out to advance the territory so far that the Rashidi family would be unable to defend themselves. Interestingly, given that the Rashidi family would split up in 1921, this proved to be a non-issue. The Sauds, however, were unaware of this at the time, and so they set about building an unstoppable army. The first step in this process was to create a legitimate nation. This is what led to the establishment of Saudi Arabia in September 1932. At this time, they did have a country, but it was essentially meaningless without an economy. Unfortunately, the Sauds had little economic prospects because they were surrounded by sand. In actuality, they had only two options. The first choice was to make use of their proximity to the ocean. They had been doing these things for centuries, but they could still build a port, go pearl diving, and fish. Since the Arabian Peninsula has been pearl diving for 7,000 years, it is obvious that it has not been particularly successful given their current state. The second option was to exploit their religious significance. Millions of Muslims visit Mecca, which is still located in Saudi Arabia, on an annual basis. However, I believe the Sauds were concerned that relying too heavily on religion would undermine their own authority. After all, they've been destroying the city since they took control. Saudi Arabia has destroyed 95% of Mecca's historic structures in the last 37 years. As a result, it is clear that becoming an Islamic Vatican city was not a priority. Saudi Arabia had to devise new economic strategies because the sea and religion were no longer viable options. And they quickly decided to put their money at risk by investing in oil. Saudi Arabia would sign an oil concession agreement with the Standard Oil Company of California just 1 year after the country was formed. Since American businesses received the vast majority of Saudi Arabia's income for many years, Saudi Arabia only received a modest dividend. Even while this might initially seem unjust, the Sauds benefited greatly from this alliance. Sure, the short-term gains belonged to America, but Saudi Arabia received the long-term investments. It is by no means inexpensive to scale up to millions of barrels per day, and guess who paid for it? The Americans. The Americans did not just provide people access to capital either. Additionally, they offered knowledge that at the time was just unavailable in Saudi Arabia. For instance, the Americans worked with Saudi Arabia to construct the world's longest oil pipeline at the time, a 1,200 kilometers pipeline, in the 1940s. The Safaniya oil field, which is now the largest offshore oil field in the world, was discovered by Saudi Arabia with assistance from the Americans in 1951. Therefore, although America was hoarding the majority of the riches, they were also creating an empire that Saudi Arabia could eventually conquer. However, Saudi Arabia wasn't in a rush. Despite the fact that they kind of stumbled into the oil sector, they were resolved to playing their cards carefully going forward. A good example of this is the founding of OPEC in the 1960s. For those who are unaware, OPEC essentially serves as an oil union for countries that produce oil. Saudi Arabia did not start to nationalize Aramco until the 1970s. According to the Saudi Aramco website, Saudi Arabia acquired the corporation rather than nationalizing it. The Saudi government reportedly purchased a 25% share in 1973, a 35% stake in 1974, and finally a 40% stake in 1980. It is unlikely that Saudi Arabia paid close to market value for Aramco, despite the fact that it is true in theory. Although the price of the purchase was never made public, experts estimate it to have been between $2 billion. Even with inflation, that's just about $15 billion. The company is now valued at over $2 trillion, despite the fact that oil output hasn't really increased since the Americans left. To put things in context, do the Americans believe they lost money on the purchase? Most certainly, but you can't really feel sorry for them considering that they had 40 years to benefit from Saudi oil without interference. And with that, Saudi Arabia officially took over control of Aramco. The journey Saudi Arabia has taken so far is not all that different from Venezuela's. Saudi Arabia effectively called in Exxon and let them be exploited for a long time before taking over. Venezuela performed essentially the same thing with Shell in place of Exxon. In fact, Venezuela was ahead of Saudi Arabia in terms of finding oil and nationalizing it. So why did these two countries end up at the polar opposites of the spectrum? Well, management and strategy are really all that matter in the end. Even if most of us don't like dictatorships like Saudi Arabia, this is one of the few times when having one has benefited the nation. You see, because they weren't concerned with their own interests, Saudi monarchs and princes were always able to concentrate on the big picture. As long as the country remained prospering, their family would unquestionably hold control and become incredibly wealthy. However, this could not be said of the Venezuelan administration. It does not follow that because the country will succeed in 20 to 30 years, so will their families. Their time in power was certainly limited, so they needed to seize the opportunity while they still had it. In other words, while they were still in charge, they had to steal as much as they could. This is the reason why government personnel embezzled $100 billion between 1972 and 1997 alone. And there is another reason why Saudi Arabia's gold and currency reserves are $473 billion while Venezuela's are merely $10 billion. Saudi Arabia not only made long-term choices and saved money, but they also invested it much more successfully than Venezuela. Saudi Arabia used their funds to establish enterprises, make economic investments, and hire foreign workers. As a result, foreigners make up 85% of Saudi engineers and 18% of Saudi CEOs. Likewise, Vision 2030 is an excellent example of this. At the same time, Venezuela was adopting socialism and devoting all of its resources to social programs and subsidized consumer goods. Thus, Saudi Arabia's reliance on oil declined, and Venezuela's dependence on oil increased. This works out flawlessly when oil is strong, but the opposite is true when oil is weak. And that's exactly what happened in 2014 when the oil price fell and the Venezuelan economy collapsed. Saudi Arabia did not appreciate this crash either, but they were able to cross over safely thanks to years of prudent decisions rather than one particular action they took at the moment. Saudi Aramco is one of the biggest and most successful businesses in the world right now. Of all, these absurd oil prices won't endure forever, and maybe things will ultimately stabilize. As a result, Saudi Aramco's profits will also eventually decline, but all that will change for them is a $100 billion annual profit. Zooming out to the long term, the world is gradually moving away from oil, but given that Saudi Arabia has also been gradually moving away from oil, this probably won't have a significant influence on the country. And I don't see any reason why this will alter in the ensuing decades given that they have been playing their cards very shrewdly since they discovered oil. Up until that time, Saudi Arabia will still be one of the few countries where an authoritarian regime has actually been successful, at least economically. When we talk about social issues, an entirely other narrative comes to light, but it is the subject of another film. Did you know Saudi Aramco was making a lot of money? Please leave a comment below. If you want to see more videos like these, think about subscribing.